Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 7 December 2024. It is the 152nd anniversary of the birth of Johan Huizinga, who was born in Groningen in the Netherlands on this date in 1872. Huizinga was a Dutch historian whose most successful book has been translated into English 3 times. Originally published in Dutch in 1919 and translated first as The Waning of the Middle Ages in 1924, then as The Autumn of the Middle Ages in 1996, and most recently as Autumntide of the Middle Ages in 2020. When a book is translated 3 times into English within 100 years, that implies a high level of interest. One of the elements that makes Huizinga's study of the late Middle Ages in the Low Countries so compelling is its masterful synthesis of a multiplicity of expressions of culture to express a single theme, that of the late Middle Ages as a time of a civilization still developing and maturing in its decline. Huizinga had obviously put some thought into historical synthesis, and he had this to say in his essay, The Task of Cultural History, which is included in the volume Men and Ideas. Quote, "In the historian's very research, if well done, lies the maturation of historical knowledge itself. The development of historical insight is not a process that follows upon critical treatment of the raw material, but is constantly taking place in the work of digging itself. Scholarship is not realized in the individual in synthesis alone, but also in analysis. No true historical analysis is possible without the constant interpretation of meaning. In order to begin an analysis, there must already be a synthesis present in the mind. A conception of ordered coherence is an indispensable precondition even to the preliminary labor of digging and hewing." Unquote. The traditional tripartite periodization of Western civilization divides our civilization into ancient, medieval, and modern periods. Or, if you prefer, you can identify this as a sequence of 3 distinct civilizations: ancient civilization, medieval civilization, and modern civilization, all sharing the same tradition. In fact, each civilization serves as the tradition for the following civilization, which incorporates some of the previous civilization, even as it passes along what it has to the following civilization. In my episode on Anna Komnena, I talked about how the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern world was a continuous transition, which contrasts to the transition from the ancient to the medieval world, which was mediated by a collapse in a dark age. There was no post-medieval dark age, only a change in the character of civilization, but a change in character so dramatic it's often identified as a change from one civilization to another. In my episode on Petrarch climbing Mount Ventoux, I talked about the different ways of defining the periodization of the Middle Ages, which we can make longer or shorting depending on where we fix the beginning and end of this period or this civilization. These 2 problems, the problem of continuous transition and the problem of periodization, are related to each other, and they're both related to the problem that Huizinga discusses in The Autumn of the Middle Ages. Given the continuous transition between the Middle Ages and the modern world, how are we to understand the transitional period between the 2? Given the problems of periodization, what historical markers are we to use to fix the beginning and end of the medieval period? We don't have the same problem in the transition from classical antiquity to the Middle Ages. There are still disagreements over periodization, but these disagreements differ for the beginning of the medieval period and the end of the medieval period. There was a transitional period at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and we can say, for example, that Gregory of Tours lived during this transitional period. But with the collapse of Roman institutions in the West, the ancient world presents itself as having played itself out. Kenneth Clark wrote, quote, "If one asks why the civilization of Greece and Rome collapsed, the real answer is that it was exhausted," unquote. An exhausted civilization sounds like a rather sad spectacle, but we could just as well speak of a fulfilled civilization, since a civilization that has exhausted all its possibilities has also fulfilled all its possibilities. So ancient civilization experienced a long, slow decline into a dark age, and medieval civilization experienced a long, slow development out of that dark age into its eventual maturity. With the transition from the Middle Ages to modernity, we could argue that medieval civilization had been in decline for a long time, and modern civilization sprouted in the fertile soil that was essentially dead medieval civilization, still shuffling like a zombie through history. Huizinga is perhaps the greatest historian to have decisively rejected this view. This was an unusual argument to make in his time. For those historians who didn't reject the Middle Ages outright as a backward period of human history, the alternative was to identify the 13th as the greatest of centuries, which is what James J. Walsh did in his book by this title. Even this high praise of the Middle Ages as having the greatest of centuries was consistent with identifying late medieval history as a time of decline. For Huizinga, the late medieval civilization of the Low Countries in northern France was not a period of decline or decadence, but the flourishing of a fully mature civilization coming into its own even as modernity was developing in parallel. The one didn't exclude the other. Huizinga wrote in the preface, quote, "This book is an attempt to view the time around the 14th and 15th centuries not as announcing the Renaissance, but as the end of the Middle Ages, as the age of medieval thought in its last phase of life, as a tree with overripe fruits, fully unfolded and developed. The luxuriant growth of old compelling forms over the living core of thought, the drying and rigidifying of a previously valid store of thought, that this is the main content of the following pages," unquote. Calling the Middle Ages a time of overripe fruits, fully unfolded and developed, is another way of saying that medieval civilization had also both exhausted and fulfilled itself, though it did so in a different historical context than the exhaustion and fulfillment of classical antiquity. Not every civilization lives to produce overripe fruit, so it's worthwhile to look into a civilization that continues to develop even as it is coming to an end. Huizinga opened his final chapter of the Autumn of the Middle Ages with this, quote, "In the middle of the garden of medieval thought, between the luxuriantly growing old seeds, classicism grew gradually. At the beginning, it is only a formal element of the imagination. Only later does it become a great new inspiration of the soul. And even then, the spirit and forms of expression that we are accustomed to regard as old medieval ones do not die on the vine," unquote. Huizinga was a contemporary of Spengler, and having written his most famous work about the decline of medieval civilization, one can readily understand that Huizinga would have appreciated Spengler's The Decline of the West. Huizinga's The Autumn of the Middle Ages was published the year after the first volume of Spengler's The Decline of the West appeared. The two of them, Huizinga and Spengler, were engaged in a similar project, documenting and synthesizing the decline of a cultural complex, and both drew on a wide selection of cultural expressions to argue their theses. The subtitle of The Autumn of the Middle Ages is "A Study of the Forms of Life, Thought, and Art in France and the Netherlands in the 14th and 15th Centuries." It's significant in this context that Huizinga referred to forms of life. The subtitle of the first volume of Spengler's The Decline of the West is Form and Actuality. Throughout his work, Spengler was concerned with what he called the morphology of world history. In his methodological essay, The Task of Cultural History, Huizinga explicitly formulates 4 theses on cultural history, the last of which is this, quote, "The chief task of cultural history is the morphological understanding and description of the actual specific course of civilizations," unquote. Both Huizinga and Spengler saw history in terms of the many forms in which life is expressed. Unlike a lot of professional historians, Huizinga was respectful of Spengler And one can see the influence of Spengler on Huizinga in the 20s, 100 years ago now, when there was a great deal of ferment in the philosophy of history. It's remarkable that Huizinga says of Spengler's main work that it, quote, consisted of 600 pages of carefully reasoned and brilliantly expressed historical exegesis, unquote. This is a rare tribute by a professional historian to Spengler's virtues as a writer, virtues for which Spengler is not usually recommended. Apocalyptic doom was in the air during the interwar period, despite the Roaring Twenties, or maybe because of it. The Roaring Twenties may have been a response to concealed despair in the spirit of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Spengler set the tone by publishing The Decline of the West just as the Great War is coming to an end. Huizinga's book, In the Shadow of Tomorrow, was based on a lecture delivered in 1935, the same year that Husserl gave his lecture in Vienna, Philosophy and the Crisis of European Mankind, which formed the basis of his final book and his sole work on the philosophy of history, The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. Huizinga and Husserl were both working through apocalyptic premonitions of Europe as it was heading into another war, arguably following the tradition of Spenglerian declensionism. Husserl mentioned Spengler only once in his untranslated, or I should say untranslated into English, Einleiten in der Ethik, but Huizinga mentioned Spengler several times in his The Shadow of Tomorrow, starting with this observation, quote, today, the sense of living in the midst of a violent crisis of civilization, threatening complete collapse, has spread far and wide. Oswald Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes has been the alarm signal for untold numbers the world over. This is not to say that all those who have read Spengler's famous work have become converts to his views, but it has jolted out of their unreasoning faith in the providential nature of progress and familiarized them with the idea of a decline of existing civilization and culture in our own time. Unperturbed optimism is at present only possible for those who, through lack of insight, fail to realize what is ailing civilization, having themselves been affected by the disease, and for those who, in their social or political creed of salvation, think to have the key to the hidden treasure room of earthly weal from which to scatter on humanity the blessings of the civilization to come. Unquote. While Huizinga mentioned Spengler with frequency, mentioned Spengler with some frequency in his book, his references are uniformly critical, despite Huizinga's respectful engagement with Spengler's thought, so that Spengler for Huizinga was a warning and a cautionary figure, as implied in the following, quote, looking more deeply into Spengler's somber vision, one finds a number of inconsistencies which seems to impair its validity. In the first place, the standards by which he judges human action prove to be closely tied up with a certain romantic sentiment. His ideas of greatness, the will of the stronger, sound instincts, healthy warlike joy, Nordic heroism, and Caesarism of the Faustian world have their roots in the soil of a naive romanticism. It is furthermore beyond dispute, I think, that the course of Western civilization during the 17 years since Spengler's Untergang des Abendlandes first appeared has definitely not been that of the ascendance of the type of civilization as he developed it. For though it is true that society has been tending in this direction, that is, in the direction of a greater technical control in the exercise of power and deliberate calculation of the desired effect, the type of human being has at the same time become even more uncontrolled, more puerile, more susceptible to reactions of feeling. It is not the hard-bitten iron men of Spengler's conception who are ruling us today. One might perhaps put it this way. The world shows the aspect of Spengler's civilization, plus a measure of insanity, humbug, and cruelty, coupled with sentimentality, which he did not foresee. For even his noble animal, which he considers man to be, should be free of all this, unquote. Huizinga not only produced historical works such as The Waning of the Middle Ages and Dutch Civilization in the 17th century, but also historiographical works that spelled out his understanding of history and the task of the historian. In his essay, A Definition of the Concept of History, Huizinga offers this definition of history, quote, the intellectual form in which a civilization renders account to itself of its past, unquote. Again, note the use of form carried over from the autumn of the Middle Ages. Huizinga continues to elaborate history in terms of forms. Quote, if history as an intellectual activity is an imposition of form, then we may say that as a product it is a form, an intellectual form for understanding the world, just as philosophy, literature, jurisprudence, physical science are forms for understanding the world, unquote. There is a subtle and implicit symmetry in Huizinga's thought revealed in this definition of history and of the task of the historian. Histories like the autumn of the Middle Ages are given an account let me start that over again. Histories like the autumn of the Middle Ages are to give an account of the forms of life. But in his definition of history, he says that history is a form also. We could say that history is a form of life. We could say that for Huizinga, res gestae, that is to say, history is past actuality, is form, and that historia rerum gestarum, the discipline that studies past history, is also form. And this is a much more subtle way of identifying res gestae with historia rerum gestarum that we find, for example, in Giovanni Gentile. This is a higher symmetry in which form mirrors form, perhaps mirroring each other self-referentially in an infinite regress. Aristotle will have hated this, since he forbade infinite regresses, but this is a structure to which we can give meaning in a way that other attempts to identify res gestae with historia rerum gestarum gets lost in incoherence. Self-referentiality and infinite regresses only seem incoherent to the finite human mind, which cannot exhaust them, but that doesn't mean we can't finitely schematize these structures. That, however, would be a large topic for another time, so I will leave that for the moment. Huizinga said further in this essay on the definition of history that the purpose of history, quote, is to understand the world in and through the past. And he rounded out his definition of history saying, quote, it remains for us to establish who renders account to himself and of what. To the question about the subject which concerns itself with history, the answer is implicit in what has just been said. It can only be a civilization, inasmuch as that word is best adapted to indicate the ideal totalities of social life and creative activity realized in a definite time and place, which for our thinking constitute the units in the historical life of mankind, unquote. Toynbee had said that civilization is the proper unit of historical analysis. Huizinga is saying something similar and saying it for similar reasons. So Huizinga, even though he's known for his detailed study of late medieval civilization and Dutch civilization, reveals sympathies both for Spengler and for Toynbee, though he might be taken for a historical miniaturist given his authored works. But recall that when Gibbon was casting around for a topic for his life work, he considered writing a work about the history of Switzerland. Imagine that this unwritten history of Switzerland had been written by Gibbon instead of him writing the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. This would have been an epic history of a small country, and this is how we could characterize Huizinga's works about the Low Countries. They are epic histories of a small country, and during a relatively restricted period of time. Being able to do something like this, to write an epic history of a small place over an historically short period of time, is a distinct achievement. One of the founders of microhistory, Charles Joyner, said that microhistory was about big questions in small places. This is what Huizinga was doing with late medieval civilization in the Low Countries, finding big questions in small places. Happy birthday, Johan Huizinga, and thanks for listening.